Hello, everyone. This is a recorded lecture to replace our in-class lecture for Thursday, October 4th. We are going to cover the normal development of fear in this recorded lecture, and we're also going to cover the reading number 3 that you could find under exam 2 readings on gender and fear. So it's probably the most helpful if you read that reading before going through this recorded lecture. So in this lecture, we're going to be focusing on the normal development of fear. So we're moving into our clinical section on child anxiety disorders. But before we move into talking about abnormal anxiety and anxiety disorders, I thought it would be helpful to have a context or background wherein we talk about the normal development of fear and anxiety in kids. So the point I really want to emphasize is that children are scared, so they are worried. They tend to have a lot of nighttime anxiety, so kids tend to get afraid at night. They tend to be afraid of the dark. They tend to be afraid of monsters. They tend to have a lot of nightmares. Kids also tend to be very interested in rituals, so they tend to want to line up their toys in a certain way or their teddy bears. They also tend to want to be read a bedtime story, sort of have a certain order of doing things at night. So the reason that we think kids are very interested in rituals is because rituals help kids increase the predictability of their environment. So if you have a ritual wherein, for example, you know that every night you brush your teeth, and then you get in your bed, and then your mom reads you a story, and then your mom turns on the nightlight, you know what's happening, and knowing what's happening helps people reduce their level of fear or anxiety. And so if we think about the situation that kids are in, they tend to have a low level of control over their environment. So we think that these rituals help them obtain some control over their environment and some predictability, help them manage their anxiety or fear. So all of these things are really common things in young people. So these are not unusual experiences for young kids to have. So they tend to be kind of worried and fearful people. So normally fears in childhood tend to be transient, meaning they change a lot. And usually these fears are pretty much benign, meaning not very harmful. So most kids are going to experience mild fears that come and go. So for example, one year a child might be very afraid of the dark, and the next year they might be very afraid of clowns, and then the next year they're afraid of monsters. And this is a pretty normal pattern for a child to have, that they're kind of having these mild to medium fears that are always changing and coming and going. However, for some kids, these childhood fears may be the seeds for more pervasive anxiety. So from these sort of normative, transient, mild fears, sometimes kids sort of grow those fears into bigger things that become impairing later in life. So take a moment now to think about what are some common childhood fears that you know about. So maybe some of you can remember some childhood fears that you used to have, or maybe some of you know some children now, and if you do, think about what are the kinds of things that you remember being afraid of, or what are the kinds of things that you've heard about kids being afraid of. So there has been some empirical work done examining this question, what do children fear? So using Child Report, a study, a pretty old study from 1935, wherein they interviewed 400 children and asked them about what are the kinds of things they're afraid of, the common fears that were reported were animal fears, injury or pain fears, fear related to imaginary creatures or ghosts, and then fears related to robbers, burglars, or kidnappers. So maybe some of these sound familiar to you, maybe some of them don't, but according to this study, this is sort of what they came up with as the main fears for children. So in this study, this is a later study from the 70s, they asked a more specific question. So that earlier study, that was sort of an open-ended interview with kids about things that they're afraid of. In this study, they asked the specific question, what are you afraid of the most? So they're trying to get each kid to think about what their biggest fear is. And when they asked the question this way, they got bodily injury as one of the main fears. So kids tend to be really afraid of getting hurt. They tend to be very afraid of monsters and ghosts, afraid of animals. They tend to have fear at nighttime, and then a lot of them tend to have nightmares. So a lot of this is overlapping with what the other study found, but slightly different pattern of results here. So these results are from a review article from 2000. So if you remember, hopefully, from exam 1, what a review article is it's when an expert in the field reads all the different studies that have been done on a particular topic and then integrates those findings together to come up with a sort of structured, cohesive picture of what the answer to this research question has been. So in terms of what this reviewer came up with, they found some general themes based on all of these interview-based studies. So they found that kids report being afraid of animals, they report being afraid of death or injury, and they report social concerns. So again, these are all the findings based on interview-based studies. So what might be some of the problems that could come with using interviews to assess childhood fears? So some of the problems that I can think of are that children may be embarrassed to report their fears. So kids tend to be kind of shy, inhibited, especially with a stranger who's doing an interview. They may not be very open about, they may not want to be very open about the fears that they have. They also may not have a lot of insight into what their fears are. So this happens a lot where a child is someone who is afraid of something in particular, like let's say spiders, and their mom knows that and their teacher knows that, everyone kind of knows that about this child. But when you ask this child, what are your biggest fears, they don't have a lot of insight into that, so they're not likely to be able to report to you that that's one of their fears. Another problem with interviews is that the interviewer expectations might bias the report. So if the interview is someone who thinks children are afraid of the dark, when they interview the child, they're likely to sort of bias their interpretation of the child's report based on that expectation. The other problem with interviews, as I alluded to earlier, is that they're not typically standardized. So, or they may be standardized somewhat, but they're not fully standardized. So compared to other measurements like observational-based measurements or self-report-based measurements, interviews tend to be relatively open-ended, so you might miss things or might just get things reported to you in a very unstructured way that's hard for us to compare between our research participants. So this can cause us a lot of problems when we use these interview-based measures of childhood fear or any kind of symptom. So to address this problem of the bias in the interview-based method of assessment, there are some child report questionnaires to assess childhood fear. So there are around 20 different questionnaires that have been created to assess fear in children. The most widely used by far is the Fear Survey Schedule for Children, or the FSSC. This was created in 1968. This fear survey asks children to rate a wide range of specific fears. So it asks them about very specific questions like, are you afraid of spiders? And the child can say none, some, or a lot. So the benefits to assessing fear using a questionnaire like this is, the main benefit is that it's very standardized. So you're going to get an answer, a numerical answer from none, some, or a lot, very standardized answer to each question that you're probing. And so you're making sure that you're covering all the same bases with all the participants, and you're getting a relatively standardized answer on all of these questions. You are reducing interviewer bias or eliminating interviewer bias because there is no interviewer in this case. And then also there's this added benefit that if a child is embarrassed by their fears, they may feel more comfortable reporting their fears on a private questionnaire. So here's an example from this fear survey. So this is exactly what it looks like. It lists these different things that kids might be afraid of, and then kids are instructed to check one of these boxes. So they can say none, some, or a lot. So it asks things like, how afraid are you of giving an oral report? So that's trying to get at how socially anxious are these kids? How afraid are they of speaking in front of other people? They ask, how afraid are you of getting punished by your mom? So sort of getting at how punishment sensitive they are. Then it asks things like lizards. So that's getting at those animal fears. It asks things like looking foolish. Again, that's more of a social anxiety symptom, being really afraid of looking bad in front of other people. It asks about ghosts. Let's see what else. Going to the hospital, snakes, roller coasters, getting sick, having to go with the principal, riding on a train. So basically what the researchers did here when they created this is try to list a whole bunch of these things that are common fears, and then you're asking the child to assess each one of these for themselves in particular. So what I showed you before in the previous slide, the FSSC, those were just example items. So those were just the first 16 items, but there are many more items on this survey. It's something like 80 or to 100. It's a lot of items. And those items, when you do a factor analysis on those items, meaning you use statistical procedures to see how these questions relate to one another, we find that there are 5 main factors. So there are 5 main aspects or underlying constructs of this fear survey. So the first one is fear of danger and death. So that is an example item from this factor is being hit by a car or a truck. So this is a child being really afraid of something that could happen to them that will cause them to die or to cause them to be in danger. The second factor is fear of failure or criticism. So this is like that item I mentioned before, looking foolish, being afraid of social evaluation. The third factor is fear of the unknown. So this is any time where a child is afraid of something that they don't know anything about or that is unpredictable. So for example, some kids are really afraid of going to bed in the dark because they don't know what is in the dark. So that's fear of the unknown. Then there are these fear of animals. This is a pretty common fear in kids. So the snakes is an example, lizards is an example, and there are a bunch of other examples on this fear survey of what kinds of animals kids are afraid of. And then the fifth factor is medical fears. So getting an injection from the doctor, getting a shot, having to get blood drawn, all of those things would fall under this factor of medical fears. So studies that have used this fear survey have generally indicated that non-clinical children, so these are kids without anxiety disorders, report a surprisingly large number of fears. So on average, kids are reporting 14 pretty significant fears, which is a lot, and it's a lot more than adults tend to report. There's also some evidence that the number of fears kids are reporting is increasing across time. So for the last 20 years or so, it seems like the number of fears kids have seems to be increasing. Since the development of this survey in the 1980s, society has also changed a lot, and some threats are now more prevalent. So for example, unfortunately, school violence is a much more prevalent threat in our current society than it was when this survey was invented or developed. Sexual assault, domestic violence, parents getting divorced, some types of diseases, like AIDS, for example, some types of natural disasters have become more common or more talked about in the news. Some types of drugs have become more common, and then also, unfortunately, terrorist attacks have become more common in some places and have also been sort of more commonly discussed in the news. So these are some new things that kids have, unfortunately, now have the opportunity to be afraid of. So what are the downfalls of using child questionnaires to assess fears? So we talked about some of the downfalls of using the interview-based method. So for the questionnaire-based method, while we're using a very standardized approach, meaning we're asking all the kids the same exact questions, the answers that kids can give are entirely determined by the items included in the scale. So if I'm a kid who has a fear that's sort of atypical or not included on the scale, and you don't ask me about it, I'm not going to be able to tell you about it. So for example, if I'm really afraid of, I don't know, leaves, and you don't ask me that on this survey, you're not going to get at that when in your measurement. And so even though I might be actually a very fearful kid, you might not be measuring that appropriately because of how standardized the measure is. Another issue that people have talked about is that kids might actually be answering these types of questions based on how aversive or upsetting they find the thought of that actual thing happening, versus how fearful they actually are on a day-to-day basis of that thing. So for example, if I ask a kid, how afraid are you of terrorist attacks, a kid might not ever be thinking about that, but when I ask them, are you afraid of terrorist attacks, they may say, oh yeah, I'm very afraid of terrorist attacks. But we're not really trying to get at that per se. We're really trying to measure how often does this child think about that outside of this moment. So on the day-to-day basis, how often are they really thinking about a terrorist attack? Is that actually a fear that they sort of carry around with them? And so for kids, sometimes making that distinction is a little bit difficult. So a self-report questionnaire for fear for a child may be somewhat distorted, and there is some evidence for this. So most of these self-report measures, if you administer them to parents and to kids, the kids are going to report astronomically higher levels of fear than the parents are going to report for their child. So it seems like, at least on some level, kids are over-reporting some of their fears. Another problem may be that kids might misunderstand the questions that you're asking them. So especially this survey was made many years ago. So some of the items use language that is sort of outdated. Like you saw, that one item said oral report. That might not be a term that a child knows. So sometimes this might not be the optimal way of assessing fears in kids. Another negative aspect of using just the child self-report is that this is just one informant. So you're not getting multiple perspectives on this child's fears. There also might be a social desirability component. So even though kids are completing these surveys for the most part in private, they still might want to report things that they believe are socially desirable. So they might not want to tell you about what they're actually afraid of because of that embarrassment factor. Another issue here is that we can only assess kids who can read or are verbal. So we have been working on trying to make these surveys more kid-friendly, more able to be done by kids who can't read. So we have research assistants sort of helping them through reading some of these questionnaires, but we do still have this problem. So kids who have trouble reading or who are not as verbal as other kids are going to have trouble with this method of assessment. And then the same issue that came up for the interview-based way of assessing is going to come up for kids in this situation as well, who have low insight into their own fears. So if you're a kid who doesn't have a lot of awareness of the fact that you have a fear, you're not going to be great at reporting it in an interview or on a self-report measure. So to deal with some of these issues, some researchers have begun using parent report of child fears. I shouldn't say begun using, they've been using these parent reports for quite a while. So this researcher interviewed moms. This is a study from a long time ago, 1932, and just asked moms what they thought their children were afraid of, and they found that moms reported things like dogs, doctors, storms, deep water, and darkness. So these things definitely have a lot of overlap with the things we've been talking about before. They're a little bit different in terms of how high on the list these things are being put, but the same general idea, like animals and medical related fears, the dark. So it seems like interviewing moms, you get at similar concepts as you do when you interview kids. So researchers, in addition to using interview-based methods, they've also used questionnaires. So this is another study from a long time ago. where they collected questionnaires from 153 parents, and they found that frequently reported fears included noises, animals, physical harm or danger, strange persons or strange people, and pain. So again, these things are similar to some of the things we talked about when we talked about questionnaires that have been completed in kids. So some overarching themes from these studies that have looked at parent and child report fears is that adults seem to underestimate their children's fear of animals, criminals, imaginary creatures, and bodily injury, and that adults seem to actually overestimate their children's fear of pain, noise, and strange objects. So why is this? Why might this be that adults would sort of underestimate some fears and overestimate some other fears compared to child report? And one thing that you might think about is that parents are going to only be able to report depending on the observations that they have. So parents are not inside their children's heads. They don't know exactly what their children are thinking or feeling, but they are able to observe their children's behavior. So they're able to observe their child not want to go to the doctor because they don't want to get a shot. So that would be something a parent would probably have a lot of insight into, because there's a clear behavioral component to that fear, and parents are often involved in taking the child to the doctor, so they're going to have a lot of good observation of that type of fear. But some fears, like, for example, childhood fears of imaginary creatures, that might be something that a child isn't sharing a lot with their parent, and isn't a very easily observed behavior. So it might be that parents just don't have a lot of insight into that kind of fear. So that brings me to this next point, that parents are only going to be able to report depending on their child's willingness to communicate about their fears. And so one thing we know about anxious kids is that they are going to be pretty guarded about talking about their fears. Not all of them, but a lot of them are going to be, because of their inhibition and because of their anxiety. So a lot of the times parents might actually not know a lot about what their child is afraid of. And so that might be one problematic aspect of relying on parent report of child fears. So overall, what does this data suggest? So if we put all this together, what we would conclude is that children typically have a range of fears. They have a lot of different types of fears. Those fears tend to be mild to moderate. They tend to come and go. And that seems to be pretty normal. So it's normal for kids to have a lot of different fears. Some of these fears seem to resemble adult fears. So, for example, spiders, that's a common fear for adults, that's a common fear for kids. Heights, that's another common fear for adults, and kids also tend to be afraid of heights as well. Diseases, that's another common fear. So some questions that are left are, do these fears change over the course of development? So are some fears more likely at certain points of development compared to others? And then, hand in hand with that, from an evolutionary perspective, why might fears change across development? So why might it be beneficial to our survival to be afraid of different things at different times in development? So some of the developmental patterns that we observe in fears are that there are normal changes across development. So fears do seem to change across development, and this seems to be true in kids without anxiety disorders. So this seems to be a normal developmental pattern. The number and type of fears do seem to change across development as well. So we're going to go into more detail about this. But basically, it seems like what's normal at one stage might not be normal at another. So for example, fear of strangers is normal in infants, but in a 12-year-old, that's not necessarily normal anymore, not necessarily useful. So if that fear of strangers persists across development, it might actually start to interfere with functioning. Some other general trends are that fear declines with age. So we talked a little bit about this before, but basically this idea is that kids are afraid of a lot of things, and fear generally seems to decrease across age. And then the other big trend that's observed in the developmental data is that Girls report more fears than boys, and this is true at pretty much all stages of development. So girls are reporting more fears, they're reporting more severe fears. So that seems to be something that we find in lots of different data sets. So I just said that fears tend to decrease with age, but there are some types of fears that tend to increase with age. So these types of fears tend to be social fears, fears about social rejection. So social fears, fears about school performance, fears about being rejected by peers, fears related to appearance. So people become much more concerned with how they're dressing, how their body looks as they're aging. So particularly getting into adolescent developmental periods, these types of social fears, concerns about performance, concerns about acceptance, those types of fears are tending to increase around puberty or a little bit before puberty. So younger kids in that range from 5 to maybe 9 or 10, they don't seem to be as concerned with these types of fears as kids in that adolescent range. So, in general, fears are tending to shift across development for kids from fears related to external things to internal things. And I'm going to go into more detail about that. But basically, there seems to be a shift from fears about concrete things to more concrete, to less concrete things, so to more abstract things. So, for example, infants tend to have a lot of fears surrounding loss of contact with their caregiver. So we talked about the attachment literature, and the main point of the attachment literature is the biggest challenge for an infant is to form an attachment bond with a predictable caregiver who's going to meet their needs. And so a lot of their fear surrounds loss of that attachment relationship. So little infants tend to have a lot of fear around separation and loss of contact with the caregiver. They also tend to have fear related to loud noises, so they seem particularly sensitive to that. And then also anything novel or new. So infants do tend to be afraid of anything new that you put in front of them. They tend to have more of a fear reaction to novelty than adults do. And so another interesting point here to note is that this fear reaction to novelty in infancy actually predicts being a fearful adult. So there does, while we're in this lecture, we're talking a lot about how normative fears change across development. There is this underlying dispositional trait-like tendency to be fearful, and that underlying disposition does seem to be relatively stable across time. So being a really fearful infant does predict being a fearful adult. So moving into the toddler period of development, toddlers also do fear separation from their parent, although that fear tends to become less severe than it was in infancy. Strangers tend to become something that toddlers fear, and again, that has to do with seeking safety from their primary attachment figure. And then some environmental things begin to be fearful things for kids. So they tend to start to become afraid of thunder and lightning. Toddlers are often afraid of darkness. They start to have fears related to animals. So dogs, barking dogs, those tend to be things that toddlers are afraid of. And at this time, toddlers begin to report having nightmares. So infants probably have nightmares too, but we just don't hear about it. But once kids start beginning to talk, they do begin to report having nightmares during this time period. And a lot of those nightmares revolve around these natural phenomena: thunder, the dark, animals, strangers. So those types of things that they're afraid of during the daytime, they also tend to have nightmares about. So by early childhood, kids are starting to have fears of more abstract things. So death is a more abstract fear to have than some of those earlier, more concrete fears like fear of noises or fear of strangers. So in early childhood, kids do still have this fear of separation from their parent, but they also begin to start having fears related to more abstract things like fears about dead people, or monsters. And so we do see this sort of transition from concrete fears to more abstract fears. So around school age, between 5 and 7 years old, kids start to have fears that are even more abstract. So they start to have fears about things like ghosts or monsters. So those are the more abstract or imaginary things that they tend to have fears related to. They also tend to have fears related to animals. So animal fear is a very common school age fear. Monsters, ghosts, like I mentioned, germs, and then natural disasters. So kids begin to have fears related to these more global phenomena that they start hearing about. So in later childhood, around between 5 and 11 years old, kids start to have more fears related to their performance. So like I mentioned earlier, they're going to start having some more anxiety about school, about their grades at school, about performance on things like tests, and also things like if they're on a sports team or they're in the school play, they're going to start worrying about social evaluation. They're going to start worrying about physical appearance, sort of what they wear and how their body looks, and they're going to start worrying about fitting in with other kids. So they're going to be worried about not being invited to things, worried about social rejection, worried about being made fun of. So this later childhood period, a lot of these performance-based fears start to come online. And then, of course, by adolescence, so 12 to 18 years old, these fears become even more intense. So people tend to be very worried about personal rejections, or their friends liking them or not liking them, really worried about their appearance. They also begin to have more worries about more abstract things like the future. So they start to worry about their own future or the future of society. They start to worry about even more global things like the societal danger, war. They start to have a lot more worry. So worry tends to be more about future-oriented abstract things, and so people around this age start to worry a lot more about things in general. So their worry increases, and they also tend to have a lot more social fears. So the overall trajectory of fear includes moving from concrete things to abstract things. So younger kids are afraid of more concrete immediate objects. So they're afraid of spiders, or they're afraid of the dark. And then older kids start to be more afraid of abstract things like not being good enough, about more sort of existential fears about what's going to happen to our society. Fears generally are moving from fears related to caregiver to fears related to acceptance from a social group. So younger kids are more afraid of separation from their primary caregiver or parent. And then as kids age, getting into adolescence, they become much more concerned and preoccupied with their ability to be a part of a group. So they're going to be much more concerned about rejection from that group and less concerned about separation from their parent. Fears are also generally changing from fears about immediate danger, so like snakes, those are things that are immediately harmful or threatening, or storms, to fears about future related danger. So in adolescence, sort of potential rejection, potential fear, a lot of worry about things that might go wrong in the future. Fears are also transitioning from early childhood focus on external sources of threat. So for example, weather or animals, those are things outside of oneself that can be harmful. So those are external sources of threat. And then we move more to internal sources of threat, meaning worrying about not being good enough, worrying about failing, worrying about your own performance on things, what grades you're going to get. So that's all stuff coming from you. That's the internal part of this. So it's all about things you're going to do or not do. So little kids are more afraid of things happening in the outside world, and then older kids are tending to be more afraid of things they're going to do wrong. So this focus of control is moving from things in the external world to the internal world. So adolescents are starting to feel more responsible for their outcomes. So as they're gaining control over their environment and their behavior, they're also gaining a lot of responsibility. And that responsibility leads to more anxiety and fear about failing in those situations. So why do these normal fears seem to change across development? Why are we afraid of certain things at certain points in our developmental lifespan? So one perspective that we talk a lot about in here is this evolutionary perspective. So like we talked about previously, natural selection is going to act on individuals at different points in development. So evolutionary pressures are going to select for a fear system that focuses on certain environmental threats at certain specific ages. And that is going to be when those threats would have been important to our ancestors. So for example, an important threat for an infant to deal with is this threat of separation from their caregiver. That's because an infant is defenseless without their caregiver. An infant can't decide to go hunt and gather some food and take care of itself. And so that fears related to predators and hunting and gathering make no sense for an infant to have, because there's nothing they can do about those types of things. The only thing really an infant can do, or one of the only main things an infant can do, is make sure that it gets a caregiver to attach to it and take care of it. So most of the infant's fears are going to be surrounding this attachment to the caregiver, because at that period of their development, that is going to make sense in terms of evolutionary pressure. That's what's going to make it most likely an infant is going to survive. So around age 5 or 6 in our evolutionary history, that's when children would have gained relative independence. So we think around that age is when human children would have begun to strike out on their own a bit, to gather food, to begin to learn how to hunt and gather, and also to begin to make decisions and have control. So not to say that they would leave altogether and wander off alone at 5, but at that age they would begin to have more independence, as they do now in modern human society. So it makes sense that around that time period, around 5 or 6, this is when animal fears should start to become really relevant, because kids would have started to go off onto the savannah or the forest and encounter predators. So it would have been important for them to have this fear of predators at that time. And then for teenagers, meaning once people or humans are reaching puberty, social position and inclusion in a social group becomes one of the most important aspects of their survival. So in order for a human to find a viable mate, being included in a social group would have been really important. So it makes sense in terms of evolutionary processes that once puberty hits, becoming really obsessed with being a part of a social group, being accepted by a social group, being attractive to potential mates, being really concerned about your body and your appearance, all of that makes total sense in terms of what your next challenge would be in your evolutionary context at that time. So an infant's challenge is just surviving, making sure someone's going to take care of them, and then an adolescent's challenge is surviving but also finding a viable mate so that their genes are going to be passed on. From another perspective, from the perspective of cognitive development, it could be that this developmental pattern of fear might be related to the progression of our cognitive abilities. So what's important to think about here is that threat has to be able to be conceptualized for a person to be afraid of something. So I have to be able to understand what a spider is in order for me to have this fear of spiders. And so conceptualization or understanding of things depends on cognitive ability. So young children are concerned with immediate concrete things like loud noises and spiders, and older children are more concerned with abstract concepts like social evaluation, being popular, death, and war. And so it could be that these fears are tracking our cognitive development, so your ability to understand something. So before you can understand what war is, it's hard for you to have a fear related to war. So part of what might be happening is that cognitive development comes before your ability to have these fears. So an example of some evidence that would support this perspective is that around 9 months old, children begin to be able to differentiate familiar and unfamiliar faces. So before 9 months old, we don't think infants are even able to tell the difference between a familiar and unfamiliar face. And then once that ability comes online, that's when separation anxiety and fear of strangers seems to become increased. So it seems like in this case, there's some evidence that this cognitive ability has to come before your fear, because otherwise, if you can't tell the difference between familiar and unfamiliar face, how can you be afraid of an unfamiliar face? So there's some evidence here that it is cognitive development that's coming before our normative fears. Another piece of evidence that supports this cognitive development perspective comes from Westenberg, 2004. They found that fears related to social evaluation increased as children got older, so that's not surprising. We already talked about that. But the surprising thing here is that they found that this age effect in social evaluation fears was fully explained by the development of cognitive maturity. So here, this is just one study, but this suggests that that increase in social evaluation is being fully accounted for by increases in cognitive ability. Another study to support this claim is from Muris et al., 2002. They used Piaget's conservation task to assess cognitive ability. So we've already covered this in lecture, but in case anyone is interested in watching a video, this is a different video than I showed you last time of a child undergoing Piaget's conservation tasks. And in one of the tasks, he does the same water test that we learned about previously in lecture, where the water from this B cup is poured into the longer C cup, and at that point the child thinks that there's more water. So they assessed the children's processes of cognitive ability using these Piaget conservation tasks. And then they also assessed children's worry by interviewing the child. And they found that increased age related to increased cognitive ability, and that increase in cognitive ability was related to their increased ability for the child to catastrophize or think about the worst possible outcome. And thus that was related to worry. So this is another example of linking this ability to worry or think about things in the future to cognitive processes. So it may be that we're not able to worry about something in the future until we have the cognitive ability to think about the future, and so that's why we're seeing this developmental change in worry across time. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears and I'm going to cover the reading that you have for lecture today. The reading is on gender and fear. So it's well established that girls report higher levels of fear than boys. So that has been found across many different studies using all types of different measurement. It seems that girls are generally more fearful than boys across developmental time points. So there are two possibilities, or two main possibilities, that can explain this difference between boys and girls. So the first possibility is that girls are just genetically or biologically more prone to fearfulness. So it could be that females have some sort of evolutionary loading for being more fearful. So in their brains and in their bodies and their hormones, it's like sort of all set up to be more afraid of things. So that's one possibility. The second possibility is that socialization can account for this difference. So perhaps we are, as a society, training girls to be more fearful than boys, or perhaps gender roles, societally determined gender roles, are accounting for this difference between fear in boys and girls. So your reading for this lecture was from Ginsberg and Silverman, 2000, and this is on the topic of gender and fear. So go ahead and you can pause the video now and complete your quiz on this reading in Canvas. So the quiz has 3 questions. One is, what population was the study conducted in, i.e. what was the study sample? 2, results suggested that blank was negatively related to fears related to failure, medical fears, and fears of the unknown. And 3, in one sentence, summarize the main findings of this article. Okay, so hopefully you paused the video and completed your quiz on Canvas. I'm going to go ahead and go through this article now. So the first question was, what population was the study conducted in? So this study was conducted in 66 children between the ages of 6 and 11. They were males and females, and all of them had anxiety disorders. So for this question, results suggested that blank was negatively related to fears related to failure, medical fears, and fears of the unknown. The answer was masculinity. So the more masculine traits that the child was reporting to have, the less fears they had related to failure, medical fears, and also fears of things that they didn't know about. So the third question was, in one sentence, summarize the main findings of the article. So this is just my quick summary. So basically, gender role orientation, especially masculinity, played a role in the development of maintenance of fearfulness in kids. So basically what they found is that the child's tendency towards a gender role, especially being more masculine or less masculine, seemed to be related to fearfulness in children. So in general, femininity, as constructed by our society currently, is more consistent with the expression of fear or anxiety compared to masculinity. So it sort of goes hand in hand with femininity that there's a tolerance of the expression of negative emotions and also avoidance. So it is more socially acceptable for a female to express distress related to fear, anxiety, or pain than it is socially acceptable for a male to express those negative emotions. It's also more socially acceptable for a female to avoid certain activities. So it seems if a female runs out of the room because there's a spider in the room, that's a more socially acceptable behavior than if a little boy does that. So masculinity is not as consistent with the expression of fear. Again, I want to say this is all in our current societal context. I'm not saying men are doing one thing and women are doing another. I'm talking about the social construction of masculinity and femininity. So boys are expected to be more brave. They're expected to display more coping behavior. They're socialized to be less avoidant. So it's seen as sort of being cowardly or sort of wimpy to avoid things that are scary, and boys are encouraged to be brave and confront their fears. Whereas in general, girls are sort of encouraged to display more negative emotions and also to avoid things if they want to. So in this study from 1990, the researchers examined the relationships between gender role orientation, and fear in 120 kids between the ages of 6 and 12. And they found that girls reported on average higher levels of fear, but they also found that gender role orientation, so your tendency to sort of adhere to a masculine or feminine gender role, accounted for more of the variance in predicting fear than child sex did. So biological gender was not associated with fear after the influence of gender role orientation was parceled out. So what these findings suggest is that it's actually more about fear. This gender difference in fear is more about the social construction of femininity or masculinity than it is about the biological gender. So these data would support that second hypothesis that we sort of put forth at the beginning of this section, which was that perhaps it is socialization processes that are more to blame when we're thinking about this difference in fear between males and females, instead of the sort of genetic influence of gender on different levels of fearfulness. So in the reading that you read for today from 2000, they use self-report measures of gender role orientation and self-reported fears in children all with anxiety disorders. And they found a similar pattern of results. So they found that masculinity was negatively associated to fearfulness. So the more masculine kids reported being across boys and girls, the less likely they were to report fearfulness. So these couple of studies suggest that gender role orientation, so the tendency for a child to like toys or activities that are associated with certain genders, that's associated with fearfulness. So for example, femininity or a preference for female toys, or more typically female toys, that gender role orientation is associated with more fear. So these findings they provide some support for the role of socialization processes in the development of fear in girls. So this isn't like a complete answer to this question about whether this is biological gender versus socialization processes, but there's definitely some support for this idea that socialization processes and societal norms related to gender do matter in terms of fearfulness. So future work is needed to investigate things like parenting, so maybe the extent to which a parent is gender normative or raising their kids in that gender normative way that may relate to kids, girls being more anxious than boys. We can look at things like encouraging avoidance, so maybe parents who are very sort of gender normative might encourage more avoidance in girls and encourage boys to sort of face their fears. So parents' gender role orientation may be an important predictor of kid anxiety, but as far as I know, that yet hasn't been researched yet. Okay, so that is the end of our lecture on the normative development of fear. So your assignment for next week, so for Tuesday, October 9th, is to find a review article or meta-analysis on child anxiety and find an article published within the last 3 years. So we're not just finding any study, we're finding a review article or meta-analysis. This can be about any aspect of child anxiety. So it can be about child anxiety disorders, it can be about parenting and anxiety, it can be the genetic basis of anxiety, it can be anything, any article, as long as it's a review article or meta-analysis and it has something to do with child anxiety. And then complete the Canvas assignment for Tuesday, October 9th, using the article that you found. So you'll be able to find a link to that in Canvas. It's basically what we've done before, where you're answering questions based on the article that you found, and then we will discuss your articles on Tuesday in lecture. Thank you, and have a good weekend.